Hello there, listeners to the Bylines Network podcast, and welcome to another episode of Bylines Reports. This time, Danny Dorling will be interviewed by Claire Jones and Neil Schofield-Hughes of West England Bylines and Bylines Cymru, respectively. They'll be talking to him about his new book, The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future. In it, Dorling explores the main concerns about the world and what the cost of living crisis shows about inequality. Mr. Dorling is an internationally renowned geographer. He co-founded the Internet World Mapper in 2005. He became Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford in 2013. The main focus of his life has been on the inequality of the widening gap between wealth and life expectancy between the rich and poor. He has a special interest in the relationship between location and life changes, and he's a very vocal supporter of progressive taxation. Please enjoy this interview.
Hello, Danny, and thank you for joining us today. Your new book, The Next Crisis, is fascinating, and you say that almost all the greatest crises in history, in recent history, were hardly imagined or were not imagined at all, just a century before they became reality. So why do you feel that exploring our relationship with crisis is an important thing to do right now?
I think it really matters right now because we've been inundated with descriptions of current events as crisis after crisis after crisis. One important thing is to work out, well, to what extent is this true? To what extent is now a different time to the past? The word crisis was used far less before the 1960s than it's used now. And the other reason I wanted to look at this is because many, if not most, of the students I teach and have taught for a couple of decades really do feel it's the end of times. You know, they honestly think climate change, other insecurity in the world, they're extremely worried. And so I think it is only fair to them to step back and actually say, what are the biggest crises? Can you put them in order? How bad are they? To what extent could they be solved? You know, I got tired of the BBC banner running out of space for, you know, there's the climate crisis tab there, there's the Gaza crisis, there's the Ukraine tab. You know, they're actually going to run out of space at the top of the page. And we never used to have special tabs for the current, you know, cost of living crisis. I haven't checked whether they've taken it off or not, but still in it. It is something that's very different from when I was young.
You and myself are both children of the 60s when we grew up in an age where there were certain certainties, certainties about healthcare, certainties about the prospect of things getting better. And you described a situation in which young people are extremely pessimistic. Do you think that is in itself a sort of symptom of crisis?
Absolutely. You can measure the degree of pessimism in the mental health of young people. And especially in the United States, the average young person in the United States now would be considered to have a severe mental problem if they were analysed in the 1950s. The level of anxiety, the level of fear, the levels of depression are so much higher. It's similar in the UK. Young people do much better, have much better outlooks in more equitable countries, much less fear. Newspaper stories are still about the poor mental health of young people. We were lucky. Well, we're both men, okay? So the late 1960s, 1970s were very good for men. They were not so good for women, our mothers. Our mothers were still fighting to get rights and freedoms, to allow the simple thing like taking out a mortgage. And we're both white men, okay? So I'm not saying the 60s and 70s were wonderful. You know, all my school friends either had parents who had a mortgage, hardly anybody had parents so rich they owned outright, or roughly half of my school friends were in council housing. And that was completely safe. You never thought about eviction. There were hardly any homeless people on the streets where I grew up in Oxford. There were two, and if you were lucky, three very old men who were still tramping on the tramping routes. It changed. I can remember when homelessness began on the streets in the 80s, young homelessness. It was a different time. And we didn't tend to count our blessings. We were angry. which is good. That's part of how you maintain and keep things. But maybe in a way, we or the generation above us were not angry enough. Almost everybody could start a family in their 20s if they wanted to. There was full employment, which meant that you could tell your boss to shove it if you didn't like a job, which was an incredible, the ultimate way of good employee relations is being able to walk out of a job and into a better one. And the class divides had never been so small, which, we are still worrying about them. We'd only just come out of an era of doffing caps and it was still there, but it's only when we lost it, as inequalities rose after the 70s, that we do look back. And if we're sensible, look back and realise what we won. Of course, there are a set of people who say that this time of great equality was terrible. It was, awful. It was, it was really bad that we had full employment. It made people lazy, but I'm interested in measuring these things. And when you measure people's health and their aspirations and so on, it does look like a very good decade.
You're talking about the relative fragility of the situation we have now compared to pre-70s. It leads on to a question I had, which was I was very taken with your expression, the Midas machine. I wanted to ask you about the cracks in the neoliberal model that are now becoming clear. Benefit doesn't trickle down, markets aren't self-regulating, unfettered free trade increases exploitation, poverty, inequality. But UK citizens, and hopefully elsewhere as well, seem to be increasingly aware of this self-serving Midas machine, and they have a clearer sense, as you mention in your book, that things could be different. So 38% of benefits claimants are the working poor. And I just wondered if this lie is wearing off, are we at a turning point? Are we shaking off the thrall of the Midas machine? And if so, are we better positioned to demand real change?
You could make an argument at the start of the 1980s that there was something inefficient about how the state was so involved in our lives. And you could make a plausible argument that if we let people free, let the talent free, then this would make everybody richer and the wealth would trickle down. And you can look at what happened in the 80s, and roughly a third of families did quite well. They got much better off in Britain. They tended to be the third who voted Conservative in 1983 and 1987, and still in 1992. And many people did badly, but a third got richer. However, the next decade, the proportion who got much better off became smaller. In the most recent decade, it's only the 1% who have seen their wealth generally increase. And trying to tell people this is going to be good for you, as the proportion for whom it's good gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and as the policy schemes, such as student loans, the idea, don't worry, we're going to charge you all to go to university, half of all young people by 18. But don't worry, you're going to earn so much as an adult that it won't be a problem. And it's all the Ponzi scheme are telling me, oh, don't worry, you haven't got a pension, you haven't got this, but you'll be able to sell your house. And that will mean you'll have a nice last 20 years. Who are they going to sell them to? You're seeing this at the top of the world, and this occurred after I finished writing the book. But the election of Trump and Elon Musk playing his games, the richest man in the world, appearing to be such a child, has really helped, I think, make the idea that, don't worry, if we let rich people get richer and richer, it's going to do us all good. You end up, on the edge of World War III if you do that. And it's more useful in terms of making an argument about this, that they're actually there, than saying there is nothing special about the multimillionaires like Trump or the richest billionaire in the world like Musk. In fact, they're actually slightly dangerous people. And if you were to pick somebody at random in the world to be in charge, they do a better job than the very richest people. And it is a dangerous, stupid system, let alone the fact that it makes so many people poor and angst. It's almost too easy now to argue against it.
I guess what concerns me is that the elite may sense but there's this disenchantment, growing disillusionment, and start using different tactics. And, one of my crises is the crisis of the use of the internet for malign purposes and algorithms and AI, etc. And I wonder whether we're at a point where that will kick in to hold people in place, believing the trickle-down theory, where ordinary mechanisms of communication worked in the past but don't work anymore.
We've always had dominant ways of thinking.
Right.
I'll never forget a BBC Radio 4 producer telling me quietly, if I were to ever question that the market is the most efficient form of distribution, I would not keep my job. But you cannot espouse the view that maybe the market at times can be inefficient. Despite the really obvious thing that the market is incredibly inefficient for health. That's why the United States spends the most on health in the world and has the worst health of any rich country. I have a graph showing that by age 30, you are 4 times more likely to die that year at age 30 in the USA than in all the combined equivalent countries in the world. It's not even, this isn't a kind of clever statistical test saying, oh, look, it's slightly worse. A market system in health is actually fatal because you end up treating the people with the most money, not the people who need it. Education is similar, housing is similar. We have a terrible housing situation in Britain. It takes time for that dominating narrative to be overturned enough by people simply saying, I'm not going to say this anymore. I don't want to repeat these lies. I know these are lies. And it takes time. We're very, very impatient. And I think our impatience can often lead to us being fatalistic. And if you look at longer term change in general, and particularly if you go outside of the UK and USA, right, it's a really good news story in general. The changing attitudes of human beings about other human beings. The fact that generally in the world, we know that war is a terrible thing. Doesn't mean that our elites in Europe don't promise Donald that they are going to spend 5% of GDP on arms. And it's possible that they're not lying. I'll be shocked and maybe I'll get incredibly depressed if it was actually true that the majority of European NATO leaders really wanted to spend 5% of the, if you like, the cash of their country every year buying arms from the United States who used to kill people. We're in a very strange time. And you worry about what's on the internet and what people see on their feeds, but what the young people in Britain see, as far as I know, is they see mass slaughter occurring overseas with weapons that involve companies from Britain. They all know. They all know. This is 99% of youngsters know. It's a bit like the Vietnam protests, but much more spread across the social spectrum than the middle class who protested about Vietnam. And of course, the UK wasn't involved directly in Vietnam. My favourite student protests were in 1938. And they very little known. These were protests at the University of Oxford against fascism in 1938, where a young student called Dennis Healy took a copy of a portrait called Guernica to the Senior Column of Balliol, seen as a terrible thing to do. And another set of students created a play in which a concentration camp was built on Christchurch Meadow in Oxford to warn against what was coming in Europe and the complacency of the people teaching them. That group of students included a young student called Iris Murdoch. But the 1938 peace protesting anti-fascist students were tiny. The 1960s ones were bigger and more widespread, and certainly outside of Britain, much bigger in the mainland Europe and France and Greece. Current attitude about what's going on, it is almost universal. And you may think I live in a strange bubble where I don't understand that there are two groups. They're not. There's 99% of young people who are watching a slaughter going on, and they know that only 3 countries in the world were involved in this, mainly. One is the United States, its proxy state Israel, and the main supporting player is UK. And they, they're aware. The question is, what will they do? We had a change before like this, which was when the young people came back from World War II, particularly the men, and they knew that their betters, their elders, had managed to engineer things so that a second world war occurred, which could have been avoided. They had absolutely no respect for the politicians who'd been in charge in the 20s and 30s. Now, they had to go to war. This is different, but I think it's very hard, to be pessimistic unless you've got a really low view of human beings.
Yeah.
To think that things are not going to get better because of the attitude you can see.
Yeah, and I would say that actually the positive side of the internet is that it has created the connectivity that you mentioned in your book. And I think Neil had a point that led on from this.
I think young people absolutely are take a very different view of the world from their elders. But perhaps, I mean, that's the problem. When I heard you speak at Hay this year, you mentioned that while on your way there, you'd heard a radio phone-in program about the two-child cap, and one caller after another was basically a procession of extremely angry people banging on about the feckless and why they should be paying their taxes to just allow the poor to have more children. And you've also written about the paradoxes that communities which are most likely to vote for populist anti-immigration politicians are actually those communities where population is falling and which are at a risk of becoming unsustainable and which need immigration. So there's this kind of vicious circle among older people, perhaps. And you, of course, are somebody as a professor of geography who's concerned with facts and evidence. How do we try and re-inject evidence and reason into this argument, these kind of debates where we just hear a sort of right-wing elderly ranting supported by tabloid newspapers?
It's a minority of the elderly who are this rabid, about and this is about these are people who've never met. These are pensioners with enough money and time to phone in to Radio 2 to talk about this group they're really angry about who they haven't met. I used to get quite a lot of hate mail, mainly from racists, mainly because I talked about immigration being good. And I always replied to it. Often it's emails. I always replied to try to get the address of the person so I could send them a book. And I did send them a book. Well, and I'm an optimist over, but also I wanted to know exactly where they lived. And all the racist hate mail I got came from small villages in fairly affluent places where, somebody was, I don't know, getting their kicks. So, because of course, all academics, their emails are available on the university website. So we're easy for a lonely person who's got some hatred and lives in a village where everybody is white. If it wasn't so easy to stir up hatred amongst so many people, that the reason why you can't have a house or do this is those people have come. But there's a pattern. When it's gone on for long enough, yes, in 1905, when we did the Aliens Act, you could have made a case that there's terrible, terrible Jewish people coming with their diseases and their weird things from the Far East of Europe. We're going to absolutely destroy our culture. So we first of all did it for the Jews. And then after Enoch Powell went out to the Caribbean, begged people to come and work here, he did, and went out and begged people from India to come and work here. He could play a game of then saying it's terrible that all these people we've begged to come here, who all were British subjects at one point, because the empire was British. And then you can play it again. You can even play it with, very white-skinned, even whiter than me, Eastern Europeans. I mean, that shocked me. It's possible to do that. But it's very hard to carry on making this same story work. It becomes more desperate. It becomes the butt of jokes. And the first thing I do in most of the public talks I do is I get the audience to put up their hand if they're born in a city. And then if they're born in the county of Oxfordshire. And normally I might get 2 or 3 people. Everybody else isn't. And then I tell them how welcome they are as immigrants and how great it is to have them here. They're almost all white. They're almost all affluent. They have, if you like, completely wrecked and socially cleansed the city I grew up in. Most people I went to school with can't afford to live in here, but still, I'm not angry about them. It's not their fault. It's how our system works. But one way of dealing with immigration is to tell everybody in a place like Oxford where our Labour councillors, bar 2, are all immigrants, white from elsewhere in the country. Right? In other cities, there will be people, 3, maybe 4 generations. But Newcastle was an immigrant city. Of course it was. Until Armstrong, there weren't people there. You might have been the son of peasants, 150 years ago in the Tyne Valley, but, it's migration. All these places are made by migration. There are far more mixed places in the world. Greece is incredibly mixed at the centre of continents, but it just needs calling out. You say no. People are now really hate being called racist, right? That's a major achievement, right? We've got to that point. But you have to remind people what racism is, because they go, I'm not racist, but, right? And even that is now a joke. So we're moving forward.
I hope we are, because you were talking about people don't want to be called racist now, and you're completely right. But there is a group of people who endorse the Great Replacement theory, transparently reject the idea that this is a racist belief to hold, and that really struck me as something that had been absorbed into mainstream culture and normalized, really.
The Great Replacement theory is only normalised if you don't laugh, if you don't go, oh, come on. And of course, it's a favourite of the people who like Musk. The idea, we need another planet, we need Mars because we've got to make Mars white again or whatever. And you've got to be kind. So I don't want to do ridicule. When people say, and you get a few formerly mildly good academics who've worked out that a career way forward is to become right wing, and they get funding, of course, from people with a lot of money. When you get them saying, I truly know what the working class think because I was a working class background, it's very easy to go back and go, exactly what grammar school did you go to then? And in that particular town just outside London that isn't particularly poor, is it? And it's a small number of people. They're very effective because there's a lot of propelling of the true understanding of the people of Britain that somebody like me wouldn't get.
Yeah.
So I remember after the Brexit vote, within a week of the Brexit vote, I sent off and published an article in the British Medical Journal showing the majority of votes for Brexit were in the south of England, which had a minority of the electorate, and they were middle-class elderly people in the south. And this is statistical. And the reason I published this article in the British Medical Journal is because they check your stats, right? So it stops somebody going, you could just add it up another way. You could, but you're not going to get published in the BMJ if you do, right? These things are not that complicated. What happened with Brexit is that in W1A, they made an editorial decision between about 10 o'clock and midnight to tell a particular story. And they zoomed in on Sunderland, which Sunderland always gets the vote first. And they zoomed in on two men without very much hair and a blonde woman celebrating the result from Sunderland. And then they told a story from Stoke. And then they created a myth, which has taken years and years to explain as a myth. And the irony is that this set of people, my age and a bit younger, in the production suite in W1A, almost all will have had parents living in places like Hampshire, most of whom voted Brexit. So they knew the truth. The truth was in their own families. The truth was the uncomfortable Christmas dinner. But the story of thick Northerners who don't know what's good for them was, was just attractive rather than the truth.
That inevitably brings us on to your views about where we are now as regards governments. Inequality increased under Blair's new Labour. I wondered if you could outline your views on the current Labour government, and does its refusal to install progressive taxation, for example, signify its adherence to neoliberal growth models, or is it a failure caused by fear of upsetting the wealthy, or because the whole idea is too radical?
Well, I should declare I am remarkably still a Labour Party member. It's an interesting bunch. I've just published something today in Public Sector Focus, which is a magazine read by people in the public sector, about carefully and politely the current people who it's been revealed are advising Starmer. And it's amazing what a small set of older than me, on the fringes, quite posh, but they apparently know the true kind of feelings of the working class. For a bit, the meanest thing I said in the article is they tend to turn their jeans up, even though they're older than me, and try and look like it was trendy in the 70s. But anyway, it is a tiny little echo chamber of West London dinner party folk who there was enough money in the family to allow them to still hang around London, even though they didn't. I'm being a bit unfair, but it's a cock-up. It's a cock-up. It's a cock-up of who kept on talking to who wanted to be influential, who kind of wheedle up, who's safe, who in no way is connected to Jeremy Corbyn, because if you are, you must be dirty. It's a very split party. We're a very strange country. We have a bizarre voting system, which is anti-democratic. It forces us to have two main parties where there is more hatred within the parties than there is outside. I mean, if you just watch how what would have been called the Wets and the Tory party were, Boris actually evicted them. So you get these bitter stories from people like Michael Heselton and so on. But Labour as well, civil war in a sense, done quite politely. But that's the state. That's the stage we're at now. There is a co-opting. You become a minister. You actually get into office, and you'll spend more time with people with lots and lots of money. And the people with lots of money will spend a lot of their money on paying people to get around and near to you. And it's relatively easy. The one I've seen most closely over the years, so I used to work on housing, is when all the house builders have a dinner at the party conferences. And there I'll try not to, well, I think for the past, it's Barrett's, Persimmons, and so on. And I used to get invited to have a token academic at the far end of the table. And there might be like 16 people. And the housing minister's there. And if they're lucky to get a deputy prime minister, if they're really lucky, because of course, you got to remember these firms at one point were paying their chief executives, in some case, £60 million in a year. And I firsthand watched the lobbying of the housing industry. And then one of the first things that came out with this new government was, oh, we're going to cut red tape and forget about nature and allow them to build. I think, oh, well, they've got good money for paying for those dinners then. So obviously that happens. It's hard to be cocky and self-assured and not to be affected. It's relatively easy for an extremely financially secure 57-year-old academic who doesn't worry about being made unemployed because I'm at Oxford. And if somebody invites me to a dinner, my first reaction is I'm too tired and too old, and I've been to lots of dinners. But if you're a younger, late 30s MP and you become a shadow minister, and then you become a minister and your salary's kind of heading up to 80 or 90, and nobody in your family's had as much, and you're terribly important and you're representing people, you can see the co-opting and you can see the change in the language over time as people spend more time in the House of Commons. And it's really sad, but never tired. And you go to meetings and they're so snobby. This is the Labour Party. I'll give you one last example of how it feels like, and I'm sure I sound snobby. I've only ever lived abroad once in my life, which is 5 months in New Zealand. And I used to, every evening, at about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, have a glass of wine and turn on the internet and listen. I'm very sad. I listened to the Today programme, but in the evening, in the beautiful landscape of New Zealand. And for the first month, it sounded normal, but then it began to sound more and more strange. You've got to remember, I'm surrounded by Kiwis. This is New Zealand, a very, very equitable culture, a working class culture. No middle class person went to divisions, but you get on and people come around and they give you wine, you don't even know them. By 5 months, every single person sounded pompous and snobby that they were interviewing. Everybody across the political spectrum. It was ridiculous that what British discourse is compared to, and New Zealand hardly that radical. And then I returned to England, and in about 2 or 3 months in, I'm back to the culture, and here's the goodies and the baddies, and I like my Labour lot, and I don't. There's an enormous similarity between our politicians. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. In the 19s and 20s and 30s, they moved to the left. Labour always underestimates how important it was that the Liberals moved to the left. Beveridge was Liberal. That report was far more important than anything going to be from Labour did in 1942. The most vocal supporter of the Beveridge report in a parliamentary debate in February 1943 was Quentin Hogg, on the right wing of the Conservative Party in the 1930s. And the Conservatives built more council houses than Labour in the 50s. So your politicians tend to move together in Britain like a pack. And they have much less freedom of movement than in many European countries where you can have 8 political parties. You actually have the party you want. And of course, you can always vote. Your vote will count and you can vote for what you want. Whereas in Britain, you can't do that. Most people who vote do not get what they vote for. And only 10% of people's votes might even matter. And even then, the chances your vote's going to swing a seat is 0.
One of the things that might have surprised, I think probably listeners to this podcast and many of our Bylines readers, is that when you rank the crises in your book, that biodiversity and climate change rank below the cost of living crisis. Many people, I think, among our readers, would assume that climate change is existential, biodiversity is existential. These are huge. These are huge things. But you've also write in the book about the way in which the politics of climate change is largely skewed by the perception, partly by the perception among some people, particularly among younger right-wing men, that it's a hoax, but also by a perception that it is essentially a crisis of overproduction that's being dumped, where the consequences are being dumped on the poorest in society. And we now have, for example, Zach Polanski standing for the leadership of the Green Party saying, no, forget all this net zero nonsense. It's actually about class, not the environment. How do you feel that the environmental issues, climate change and so on, actually play alongside issues of poverty and inequality and class?
This is really interesting, and we're getting very rapid changes in the last couple of years. It's not just Zach, it's Tony Jupiter, who I think is, I don't know, not quite the head of Natural England, has just written a book saying that inequality is as important as the environment. So I think the Green lobby are beginning to realise that one of the issues that's been turning people off, because concern about climate change, even in the UK, has been dropping over time. We're crying wolf for other things that are happening, is not a realisation that it is different for different people. I mean, most importantly, and in a way, really fortunately, the curve of emissions goes up like this. It's almost exponential. It's not that if somebody has twice the riches as somebody else, they pollute twice as much. They pollute 3 times as much. So in societies that are more equal, overall pollution per capita is much lower. It's the opposite from what right-wing Greens used to say in the past, the kind of ecology magazine ones, that it would be very bad to give poor people more money to just turn the heating on and burn the planet. But it's fine that I've got 10 million because I'm going to build an estate and have some nice sheep in it or something. I'm going to be a conservative. It turns out when you look at the numbers that one thing that silly human beings do as they become rich are hobbies and recreations that are incredibly. I mean, the obvious ones are having a private plane, right? But I think there's possibly more private planes in the UK than in China. Of course, China has a rail system that works. But also buying yourself a huge yacht and moving it between islands in the Aegean using enormous quantities of diesel. I mean, it's hard to come up with ways. Or in the city of Oxford, when we look at pollution, the highest pollution is in the north of the city, and it's people leaving their windows open with their heating on because the heating bill's not an issue for them in the £2-3 million houses. So understanding that you will get your emissions down most, the more equal your population is important, but also understanding that having rich people preach to you about the climate when you're worried about how you're going to get food for your kids, it's really annoying. And we speakers have to square these things and say the two are very connected. The book is based on surveys, which are largely of the world's middle class because they complete surveys. And it was a shock to me to find how many slightly better off than average people are so absolutely concerned by the cost of living crisis. And second to that, and I joined them together, was that inequality and poverty had risen to be the most important thing in the world just before the cost of living crisis, as far as the middle class were concerned. And it's a feeling of personally feeling you're losing out, you're slipping behind, you're not making it. For people who are ahead of 90% of other people, but they're still feeling you're slipping behind. But also a growing concern for other people in society, which may well begin with cousins, children, grandchildren, but extends a bit to what else is happening in my village or neighbourhood or town. And a memory of it didn't used to be like this. It was nicer. People got on with each other better, maybe slightly rose tinted. But and this is a success. The fact that inequality and poverty across the entire planet has gone up to be the most salient social issue is a huge success of arguing and refusing to, be quiet about something that really matters, and quite a complicated thing. The idea that the gap between us is really important to how we all get on is not an easy thing to think about.
Couldn't agree more, actually. Well, I wanted to ask you about journalism, actually, because obviously everything that we've said bears on that. The mainstream media at the moment seems to be increasingly corrupted, by which I mean it seems to have been drawn to the sort of sycophancy of appeasing Trump and staying quiet on the key issues like Gaza, etc. I mean, we seem to be chronically in that state at the moment. And also, the internet is weaning people off these collective sources of information anyway. So I wondered if you could say something about the role of independent journalism, and in particular citizen journalism, as we have outlined it, in this new media landscape.
It's really interesting to watch the rise in alternative journalism, and across the spectrum, from people putting up things on YouTube and then seeing how many thousands of people watch it, and of course on YouTube you can actually then see the demographics. You've got some idea, through to what you're doing, and these things simply were not possible. You could get yourself one of those printing things where you turned a drum and it smelled. I can remember the 70s and 80s, but the effort to do it. This is good. I think what helps it as well is dissatisfaction with mainstream media. I was trying to explain to a younger colleague yesterday, I work at the University of Oxford, how certain things work at university. And I said, you must watch a TV series, probably from the 80s, called Porterhouse Blue, which you may remember. Now, Porterhouse Blue is about a fictional Oxford Cambridge college and corruption, and it was a satire done by the BBC. When the BBC was still actually effective, when particularly its comedy was radical. And the BBC, we often forget this because we see old clips from the BBC where they're dressed in a dinner jacket and we think it looks pompous. The BBC was staffed by young men and women, a remarkable number of young women in the 20s and 30s, because it was new technology and the oldies didn't know how to do it. So we had in Britain, and you can talk about what the Guardian was like in the 60s and 70s, we had a radical press, including a radical state broadcaster, poking fun at the establishment. The underlying idea of Porterhouse Blue, where the theme tune was sung by the Flying Pickets, commissioned by the BBC. These are ex-striking miners, right? Think about this. Just a little unspit image. The underlying message of Porterhouse Blue is, well, this is funny, and of course this kind of thing is going to disappear. You're not going to have Latin and all this stuff in future. What we have now is still Latin. In fact, if you like, Oxford and Cambridge colleges try to be even more in some way. There's lots of things that got better, but yeah. And a BBC that wouldn't dare do the kinds of things that it used to do. And that creates space for making it actually interesting to read alternative things. You also get to read what's happening 24 hours before you get to read it on the mainstream media. If you really want to know what's going on, certain Twitter feeds will do that. But remember, we're in the UK. In so much of the rest of the world, there is a much cleaner media. The cleanest one is Finland, which is it wins the awards. There's a ranking every year for press freedom. It can be a little bit boring, the Finnish media. I mean, it's very, very, just practical, but it's the best. I was talking to another colleague yesterday from Australia, though, saying they just watch in disbelief at what's happening in the UK. And that's the reports they're getting in the Australian media, where, of course, Murdoch still plays a large part. So the idea that in Australia, you watch in disbelief about what's going on in Britain and what on earth happened to this country. There is a huge world out there of 8 billion people. There are enormous numbers of different channels. You can watch Al Jazeera. It's very hard because we've almost banned it, but you can see a different view on what's going on in Gaza. And then I switch between Al Jazeera and the BBC and back again, just to get a feeling of where am I living. The UK is the most unequal country in Europe, with a level of inequality back to the 30s. Things are not good where we currently are. The only saving grace for us, we can look at the United States, where it's worse and where progressive politics has kind of gone silent and people are genuinely scared. What we forget is vast mass of humanity are living somewhere a little bit more free, a little bit more liberal. Not always the case, and we can go through the countries with the dictators, always a man, of which the largest, be careful, not a dictator, but problematic country is India, which is also the country where most people say that everything's going well because the Modi government's propaganda has been incredible. India's had the largest increase in inequality, by the way, anywhere in the world, as far as we can see recently. The data isn't properly released. But changes in South America, changes in most of Europe, watching what's happening in Canada, watching elections now, an effect of Trump being in power is helping people across the planet realize that this is what you get if you go for the man with that particular story. A wider range of media is absolutely vital. We're not going to go back to a world in which we get a Guardian newspaper anymore, which is required reading for people in their 20s sitting in university lecture theatres, as it was for a generation. That has gone forever. The Guardian's never going to go back again like that. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because that was a tiny number of people at the editorial meeting at 10 a.m. in that newspaper deciding what was important for the progressive half of British politics. That's now gone. This is interesting. This is new.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on the one hand, you've got this fragmentation of information that the internet and the demise of mainstream media has created. But in a way, that's a good thing, but it's also possibly a bad thing. And I wonder whether we need a new kind of collectivism. There was something important about everybody sitting around the TV watching the same news, because it created a reality that we could share, but we don't have shared realities anymore.
It created a reality we could share, but that reality, at the height of that shared reality, it was coronations. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth was, everybody watched it. But that thing, the watching that young woman have a crown put on her head, wasn't a normal human thing when you think about it, right? It was quite interesting watching her son being crowned, shared reality, and the curtain putting round and the oil put over his naked body, or whatever went on in that kind of thing. So there isn't a golden age where the shared. It was nice you could talk about the same thing, something as utterly bizarre as a coronation of a human being. We live in a world of no more divine rights for kings and queens, except in the UK we do it. We have new shared reality. So one fascinating thing is watching the Financial Times becoming more left wing than the Guardian. Now, the Financial Times didn't do this because there was a sea change about belief in the editorship. It's because it's become the paper of record of Europe, and the only way you can sell it in mainland Europe is if it actually is slightly closer to selling the truth than average. Otherwise, the FT wouldn't be able to have. It's ridiculously expensive. I wouldn't subscribe. But watching the Financial Times, John Burr Murdoch is their most famous, I think, data analyst. Watching the FT produce the most progressive journalism of the mainstream media in Britain. Would you have predicted it would be the Financial Times in the 80s? So incredible. And it's things like, Scotland, which had the worst child poverty when I was growing up, having the lowest. Good things happen. We tend to discount them and worry about the next crisis, the next worst thing. We don't go, what on earth happened so that the FT is telling a more truthful story about the world than the Guardian? Apologies to my Guardian friends, but I'm not going to keep saying it until the Guardian moves to the left of the Financial Times.
Can I just come in there with a thought about one area where we do seem to be witnessing a crisis is in the legitimacy of the United Kingdom itself, and movements in Scotland and increasingly in Wales for independence and to change the constitution. You've described the kind of absurdity of British society that we live in now. How would you see an independent Wales, an independent Scotland, as being one way in which, for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in Wales or Scotland, to address that? I mean, we already have quite significant differences in Wales. We're just talking about, for example, adopting for our healthcare system the Marmot principles, which I think makes us the first world country in the world to do that.
And you have the safest roads in all of the UK. Because of a single thing you did, which is that 20 mph becomes normal. Yes. So I will be amazed if by the time I die, the United Kingdom is still the same constitution that it is. Freddie Heineken, the man who made the beer, who became very rich making beer, paid some historians, this is 2 or 3 decades ago. No, this is before the 90s, it's older. Paid some 2 historians to create the Heineken map of Europe, which was a projected future set of countries. And this was partly seen as ridiculous until the projections for what was Yugoslavia became true. And then people take the Heineken map. So you see, the nicest thing about the Heineken map, you just Google it, Freddie Heineken map of Europe, is it predicts the splitting up of England's always a difficult thing. What would the regions be? And it does really clever things. Like I think it might make Newcastle the capital of a region that includes Yorkshire. But it's kind of how like so, and the place would be called Yorkshire, but Newcastle would be the capital, which stops in Yorkshire. Anyway, it's impressive. Countries rarely ever escape. Sudan is it's very, very hard to get independence. There's an amazing thing about that. One of the rules about independence in the world is that the national debt stays with the mother country. But I think the folk in Scotland who want independence say they're willing to take some of it. And they're not going to leave England with all the debt. If anywhere is going to become independent in Europe, it'll be Scotland first. Much harder for Barcelona. The whole question of Ireland, what on earth do you do if you're sitting next to really an increasingly successful state, the one state in the EU that speaks English, which in some ways mimics Switzerland. Ireland's got its problems, but increasingly successful. And you're part of the North, and things can happen and often do happen without anybody saying formally, this is what is occurring. You change rules, you don't change titles. But Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland had 2 main aims, I think, when she became First Minister. One was independence, and the other was reducing or removing child poverty. New Labour failed to do this. They moved 1 million children from slightly below the line, slightly above it. Didn't alter inequality at all, didn't. Nicola Sturgeon has produced the biggest drop in child poverty we have seen in decades in the UK. The only areas in the UK with falling child poverty are in Scotland now. That is a special payment brought in during the cost of living crisis at the end of the pandemic. Originally £10 for every family with a child under 6 claiming any benefits, untapered. It's now headed towards 30 for every child under 16. It's about £4,000 if you've got 3 kids and you're in a year, £4,000 a year. You don't have to go cold or hungry if you're a child in Scotland anymore. They just decided. And the best thing, this is about politics, is the Scottish Labour Party had an internal quiet debate and decided to back the SNP on this. And they don't talk about it because obviously they don't like each other. But Labour and the SNP in Scotland have decided that this really matters. And then you've won. Now, Scottish children used to come down to England to universities. There used to be loads of Scottish students in Oxford. There were none. There's not one. Scottish children now go to Scottish universities. Of course they do, because they aren't charged a ridiculous fee. Scotland has already left culturally. It has left. There are no more Michael Goves. These Scots who come down and taught how to be kind of English but keep their accent. That Scotland has left the UK culturally. It's left it over its university system. It's left it over the migration of its young people. It's left it over its tolerance of poverty. That how you catch up with the legal side of things is different. And in a way, the unraveling is hardly surprising, because the original coming together was a marriage of convenience, because it made more sense to come together, and then we could start raiding the Spanish galleons full of gold. We originally were a pirate nation that came together to fund our pirates to take the gold that was coming out of the Americas. That's with kings and queens who didn't actually speak English, but commissioned Rule Britannia as a song. It was paid for by a monarch. We're a manufactured sort of nation. There was a time when they wanted Scotland to be called Northern Britain. The Victorians tried to get rid of the word Scotland. Yeah. So it's tricky, but these large countries of 60 million odd people don't necessarily work that well. Germany does a very good job with its federations. It's already happening. I'll be amazed if by the time I die, there isn't actually a formal realization that it's different United Kingdom.
I think we have to probably end there. Just wanted to say very quickly that one of the things I got from your book and also from this interview is your wonderful, energizing optimism. It's great to hear that to keep us going in our endeavours.
Honestly, things like the most basic statistics of child health getting better in the world. Every year, fewer and fewer grieving parents every year in the world than the year before. These are the most important things. University access. When you had to go into the mill at 14, which was completely normal, you never believed you were able to have an opinion. And I don't like the way we increased to have such a large number of people going, but I love the fact that by the age of 32, 2/3 of the population will have stepped into a university at some point. Over half have a degree. Yeah, and this is for UK. There are honestly so many good news stories in the world.
Thank you very much for joining us on the latest episode of Bylines Reports, and thank you very much to Danny Dorling for agreeing to be interviewed by our wonderful Editor-in-Chief of Bylines Cymru and West England Bylines, Neil Schofield Hughes and Claire Jones. We do hope that you're enjoying our various series and mini-series on the Bylines network, and if you want to support us, please continue to listen, please donate to our Chuffed page, or buy our merch. It really helps us go a long way. Please join us next time, as I'll be talking to two of our contributors about transgender rights in the United Kingdom. Until then, listeners.